Now we're going to be talking about the LGBTQ+. So we're going to stop at 1 p.m. for Q&A. So we have 22 minutes, which I said we'll do it in 20 minutes. The LGBTQ+. And I really believe, my dear brothers, this is one of the most dangerous ones. If you look how fast this movement has spread across the world, it's unbelievable. It is unbelievable. They want to destroy social and moral hierarchies. They want to destroy what it means to be a man and a woman. They want to destroy the ethics of Islam. This is a war against humanity. This is a war against a woman. This is a war against man. This is a war against Allah and His Messenger. It is one of the most dangerous ideologies that is creeping in this country. It was at LUMS, it's at the private universities. To the degree that external forces are giving lots of money to influencers in this country to promote this ideology. And they try and trap you. They trap you, the ism trap, with the false idea of love is love. What's wrong with you? Allow men to love men and women to love women. Why are you so evil, you people? You loveless people. You're not compassionate. Turn the tables and say to them, no, you're wrong. We are the most loving people. Because love is intentional and directional. You intend and you direct your love for them, that you want goodness and guidance for them. We know what goodness is and we know what guidance is. You don't. You're the loveless people because you want them to obey and submit to the blameworthy desires and to identify with the blameworthy desires. We want them to be liberated and happy by worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and for them to have true well-being and guidance. We are the people who are loving people, not you. Don't give me this rhetorical trap of love is love. If love is love, then water is water. Drink from the sewer. If love is love, then food is food. Eat a dead person. What kind of rhetorical nonsense trap is this? Love is love. No. Love is intentional and directional, and a key aspect of love is that you want goodness and guidance for people. You cannot love someone without wanting goodness and guidance for them. What is goodness? What is guidance? That's the point. Don't let them trap you with this rhetorical trap. And just because you're naive and you're 18 years old and your brain hasn't developed formally yet, properly yet, because it develops up to the age of 25 or 28, don't fall for this rhetorical trap just because they're using these slogans. Turn the tables. If love is just love, then water is just water. Drink from the sewer. If love is just love, then food is just food, then eat a dead person. Nonsense, rhetorical trap. Love is intentional, directional. We love for people. We want goodness and guidance for them. And for them to do haram things and to move away from the obedience of Allah and to believe in gender fluidity and to have same-sex sexual intercourse, this is completely bad for them in the dunya and the akhirah. This is why we're more loving than you, because we want you to be good. We want you to be guided. Does it make sense? Don't fall for the love is love trap. It's nonsense. Bakwas on Burj Khalifa. Bakwas on stilts. So the LGBTQ narrative, what does it basically say to us? It says to us that same-sex intercourse and gender fluidity is perfectly fine. It's an individual right and it is not immoral. That's what they're saying. It's an individual right and it is not immoral. Let's challenge this. And before we challenge this, we have to understand, brothers and sisters, every truth claim has assumptions. Every truth claim has assumptions. These assumptions are coherent and they could be grounded in reason, or some assumptions are incoherent and they cannot be grounded in reason. For example, and listen to this claim. the claim of secularism. That only secularism can address the social political affairs of all people. That's the claim. That claim has assumptions. One of the assumptions is that they believe religion does not have the tools to deal with the social political affairs of other people who don't belong to their religion. False, because Islam has a framework to deal with minorities. Also, it has the false assumption of metaphysical narcissism. They're narcissistic metaphysically. They're projecting themselves on other ideologies and worldviews, and they say only secularism can deal with other peoples and minorities. So it has that assumption. It also has the assumption that all religions are like Christianity, because it's a very Western Eurocentric notion. Because what does Christianity say? Essentially, render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's, and render unto God's what is God's. He also has a particular notion of the divine, that the divine is incapable of being able to provide guidance and solution for humanity through revelation, which we know is not true because we have the Quran and the Sunnah that has lasted over 1,000 years dealing with people from different religions and backgrounds. To the degree that we had Islamic Spain, for example, that was described by academics as a convivencia, a coexistence. The academics called it paradise on earth, where Muslims, Jews and Christians will work together to look into the interconnecting principles of nature, to the degree that the second Moses of the Jewish tradition, who's known as Musa bin Maymun, Maimonides, he would write in Arabic. He was a product of Islamic Spain, and he was the physician of Salahuddin Ayyubi. You had Professor Thomas Arnold in his book, The Preaching of Islam, who says that Muslim Spain was that necessary milestone to project Europe into its progress and into the Renaissance. What nonsense assumption is this, when we have historical and theological evidence to show that we have the tools and the principles and the framework to deal with people other than Muslims? Now, I'm not going to unpack this too much. I'm just giving you an example that even the secular mantra has its own assumptions. Every truth claim has assumptions. Even the truth claim of the LGBTQ plus ideologues and advocates, that same-sex intercourse and LGBTQ transitioning and gender fluidity is completely fine. It's an individual right and it's not morally wrong. That has its own assumptions. And there are 5 assumptions we could unpack. And these assumptions, some of them contradict each other. And the advocates don't all agree with these assumptions, but at least some of them or all of them are implied with regards to the LGBTQ plus advocates. Assumption number 1, they would argue that we own our own bodies. Yes, we believe in Islam, we have given a right from Allah to use our bodies in a particular way, but it has to be in line with the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But fundamentally, we don't own our bodies. Allah owns us. And therefore, Allah has every right to tell us what to do with our own bodies. We don't have this second and atheistic assumption that that Allah doesn't own our bodies, that we actually fundamentally own our bodies. And they would argue, it's your body, do what you want with it, as long as you don't harm other people. This is a false assumption. Allah is the Rabb. Allah is the master, maintainer, owner of everything that exists, including our own bodies. And He has every right to tell us what to do with something that He owns. But they would argue, no, we own our own bodies. Now, there are some religious people, either Muslim, unfortunately, and Christian, that may believe in God, but they still adopt LGBTQ plus narrative. And they may say that, okay, well, Allah owns our bodies, but He allows us to do whatever we want. Which is not true, of course. But that's a key assumption of many of the LGBTQ plus advocates, which is self-ownership. And we totally categorically reject this assumption. And you should be able to unpack that and say, you're assuming that you fundamentally own your body and you think you could do what you want with it. That's a false assumption. Allah owns us. He has every right to tell us what to do with our bodies. Is this clear? Who owns our bodies? Therefore, Allah has every right to tell us what to do with them. Number 2, second assumption. It's an individual right. It's an individual right to have same-sex intercourse. It's an individual right for gender fluidity. Remember what we discussed with regards to liberalism. According to whose conception of rights? Yours or Allah's? Allah has every right to tell us what to do and how to act and what our rights are. He created us, He gives us our rights. So don't assume that they have a universal and they have this absolute moral framework and legal framework they could impose on you in a hegemonic way. Don't let them colonize your minds. They colonized our lands for a long time. Don't let them now allow them to colonize your heart and mind. Don't allow them to do this. Have some izzah. Have some honor. Understand that their conception of individual rights is a liberal conception, is a particular secular conception. We are under no obligation to adopt their conception of individual rights. According to whose conception? Yours or Allah's? I'll take Allah's, thank you very much. Third point. They say there's nothing immoral about same-sex intercourse and gender fluidity. Again, according to whose conception of morality? We already discussed this in the first part of the second section. We discussed utilitarianism, consequentialism, ethical egoism, deontological ethics. We discussed, even in the first part, divine command theory, and in the second part now, that why do we have to adopt your normative ethical theory? You are assuming consequentialism or deontological ethics, or both. We are under no obligation to adopt your ethical normative theories. We are divine command theorists. Thank you very much. And we could explain to you why it's more coherent and true. Don't let them colonize your heart and mind. Don't let them try and make you assume that their morality is absolute and universal. Don't let them occupy your mind and your heart and your ruh. Don't let them enslave you intellectually and ideologically. You say to them, you are assuming that utilitarianism or consequentialist ethics or ethical egoism or deontological ethics is the normative ethical theories to follow. We reject this. We follow Allah and His Messenger. Thank you very much. Is this clear? Fourth point. They say that you identify with your desires. There is an assumption that you must identify with your desires. We completely and categorically reject this notion. Our identity is that we are servants to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't identify with the blameworthy with the desires. We make a distinction between the desire and between who we really are. Who we really are servants to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're not going to follow your false assumption that your happiness, your well-being, your identity is contingent to following your blameworthy desires. What kind of nonsense animalistic rhetoric is that anyway? What kind of enslavement to the lowliness of the biological, bestial aspects of the human being? Animals. It's an animal rhetoric. And it's a trap and a slogan. You show them that we elevate ourselves. And the way to elevate ourselves is not being enslaved to our blameworthy desires. Our true elevation is being enslaved to? Enslaved to? Jazakallah khair. Final point. Fifth assumption. And by the way, they don't all agree with these assumptions. Some of them contradict each other as well. Kufr would always contradict itself. So the fifth assumption is what we call queer theory. And this justifies the transgender movement, the T, the LGBTQ, the T and the Q. And they're arguing amongst themselves to divorce themselves from the T and the Q because it contradicts them, each other. So gender fluidity, being queer, being trans, is based on applied postmodern principles. Now, we don't have to get into postmodernism right now. It's a slippery snake, hard to define, huge history. But let's talk about its applied postmodern principles. Postmodern principle number one is what? Radical skepticism. They don't believe that there is a method to acquire an objective truth. They don't believe that there is a method to acquire an objective truth. And queer theorists would say, therefore, biological categories, gender normativity, what you consider to be normal, and what you consider to be normative with regards to sexuality, these categories were radically skeptical about them. Not only that, they totally and fundamentally reject any form of biological essentialism. They say there are no biological markers because we're very radically skeptic about science itself. Science is not objective. Biological markers are not objective. We're not going to allow that to dictate our identity, our sexual identity and our gender. Don't get me wrong, they were motivated by the rejection of biological essentialism. And Muslims don't accept biological essentialism in its totality, but we don't throw it completely out of the window. We appreciate, just like most normal human beings, that there are biological essential traits and there is socialization, and they both come together. And we know this in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. But they reject it completely. So that's number one. Number two, postmodern principle, socialization and social hierarchies. They believe that society is made of social hierarchies that decide what is to be known and what is not to be known. And they use language, and that language perpetuates that so-called truth, what could be known and what can't be known. And they say that these social hierarchies and the language that you use are sources of oppression and injustice. Queer theorists would apply this principle and say, therefore, we live in societies with social hierarchies that determine what sexuality you should be, what gender you should be, and what is a gender and what is not a gender. And they totally reject this, and they believe this is a source of oppression, and they even say it's a source of violence. So do you understand what's going on here? And that's why you have the likes of Judith Butler, who's still alive. She's a lesbian philosopher, I think at Berkeley University. She has this idea of gender performativity. Gender performativity is that you perform your gender, not like an actor or an actress, but it's more like you have a powerful structure or hierarchy and you have language, and that allows you to express a particular identity. For example, being a husband and wife. In the West, the authority or the priest or whoever would say, by the power invested in me, I now announce you as man and wife. By virtue of his authority, power, by virtue of what he's just said, the language, they are now man and wife. They perform man and wife in a real way. But 5 seconds ago, they weren't man and wife. So she argues, if that's the case, gender is the same. You could agitate the power structures, give power to yourself, agitate the current normative language, create your own language, and you could be any gender you want, irrespective of any biology. Which is complete nonsense. Because if that is true, I could say the following, and we should show the absurdity in the same way. I can say this: from now on, I am a black lesbian. That is totally coherent according to the ideology. Because if there are no biological markers, it's just about language and authority, then I give myself authority and I use the language irrespective of biological markers. I'm a black lesbian. In actual fact, I don't have to change anything physical about me, because they reject biological essentialism in totality. So you could expose them by saying, I'm a black lesbian. Or I can even say something different. I am a rat. I identify as a rat that eats biryani on Fridays. They say, oh, how dare you, being so, I don't know, facetious or stupid or whatever. No, I'm following the implications of your own philosophy. Here's one that undermines the whole thing. Their main drive is oppression. They say social hierarchy is a source of oppression and violence. And they assume oppression, injustice is objective. But remember the first postmodern principle that's applied? There is no method to acquire an objective truth. If there's no method to acquire an objective truth, why do you assume the objective truth of injustice and oppression? Game over. Contradiction. Go home. Allah says in Surah Mumtahana, verse 8, chapter 60, chapter 60, verse 8. Allah does not forbid you to be fair and kind with those who do not fight you for your religion and expel you from your homes. Allah uses the form of the word which is bir, which really means righteousness. And that's used in chapter 19 in the context of one's mother, to be righteous to one's mother. So if someone is not fighting you for your religion, they're not expelling you from your homes, you need to be righteous to people. We cannot use this as an excuse now to start being violent and aggressive in an inappropriate way to these people and ideologues. Even though we may hate them and hate their ideas, we have to be righteous and fair. Is this clear? And we have the truth. And once you expose these there's more assumptions, by the way, but these are 5 key assumptions. You expose them. You show what Islam says about them. Inshallah, they'll understand that what they are upon is total nonsense. Now, before we end, it's important to know that these queer theorists, they also have a view on language, which comes from the postmodern thinker Derrida. Derrida had this view on language, that language doesn't represent reality. Language is relational, and he coined something called phallogocentrism. Phallogocentrism means that Western language is inherently masculine, and it favors the masculine and it oppresses women. For example, what's the opposite of a man? What's the opposite of a man? Woman. It's relational. Just that language itself is oppressive because you're saying what is opposite of a man? Man's first, woman's second. But he argued that language doesn't represent reality. That's why if you change your language, you could change your reality. Which goes against the Quran, because Allah says that He taught Adam alayhi salam the names of things, which in the tafsir means names, properties and features of things. Language represents reality. We don't adopt this kufr, this nonsense. That's very important to know. So, we've unpacked the 5 key assumptions of the LGBTQ plus ideology and responded to those assumptions with the Islamic perspective. And the way to give dawah to these people is say, look, yes, we have our own take on your assumptions, and we believe our take is correct because it's come from Allah and His Messenger. And we can prove Allah exists. We can prove the Quran is from Allah. We can prove the Prophet ﷺ is the final prophet. And what comes from this truth is true. You don't have any proof for your foundations. It's completely nonsense. And in essence, they are just people of shahawat.